I never imagined I'd lose custody of my children over a fabricated lie. But there I was, standing in that sterile courtroom, gripping the edge of the wooden table until my knuckles turned white, watching Judge Harmon stare down at me with eyes that had already decided my fate. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm inclined to grant full custody to your ex-husband." I felt my world collapse around me. 13 years of motherhood, thousands of packed lunches and bedtime stories, all about to be erased by a man who'd spent 15 minutes reviewing my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But that wasn't the end of my story. Not even close. My 14-year-old daughter Lily sat beside me, her small hand suddenly reaching for mine. Most people in that courtroom saw a scared teenager, shoulders hunched under her navy blue cardigan, trying to disappear. What they didn't see was her other hand, sliding into her backpack, fingers wrapping around her phone like it contained the last breath of air on Earth. The court clerk was already preparing the paperwork. My ex-husband Richard was leaning back, in his chair, that familiar smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, the same one he'd worn the night he told me he'd make sure I ended up with nothing. His attorney whispered something in his ear, and he laughed. Actually laughed. Like, my children were prizes he'd just won at a carnival. That's when Lily stood up. No one asked her to. No one expected her to. At 14, she was supposed to be invisible in these proceedings. A name on a document, a custody percentage, not a voice. But there she was, standing on shaking legs, raising her hand like she was in class. "Your Honor," she said, her voice small but startlingly clear. "I need you to hear something before you decide." The judge looked startled, annoyed even. He glanced at his watch before responding. "Young lady, this isn't the appropriate time." "It's about my dad," Lily interrupted, something she'd never do normally. My shy, rule-following daughter was breaking protocol in a courtroom. "I have a recording of what he really thinks about us, about taking custody." The room went completely still. Richard's face drained of color so fast I thought he might faint. His attorney straightened up, suddenly alert. And Judge Harmon's expression shifted from irritation to curiosity in an instant. "Approach the bench," he said. "But I should back up. Let me explain how we got here, because this wasn't just about one moment or one recording. This was about years of calculated control, of a man who knew exactly how to present himself to the world while being someone else entirely behind closed doors. Richard and I met at a charity fundraiser when I was 26. I was working as an event coordinator, rushing around with a clipboard and a fake smile, trying to make sure everything ran smoothly. He was a guest, handsome, confident, with a laugh that seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. When he asked for my number, I hesitated. Not because I wasn't interested, but because men like Richard, successful, charismatic, seemingly perfect, didn't usually notice women like me, perpetually stressed and hiding in the background. But he persisted. Flowers delivered to my office. Thoughtful text messages, dinner reservations at restaurants I couldn't afford on my own. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, married. By our second anniversary, I was pregnant with Lily. The first few years were good. Not perfect. No. Marriages, but good. Richard was building his financial consulting business, working long hours but always making it home for dinner. I'd left my job to care for Lily, and later our son Max, who came along 3 years after his sister. We moved into a beautiful house, in a neighborhood with good schools. We hosted dinner parties where everyone commented on how lucky I was. And I believed it. The shift was so gradual, I almost didn't notice it happening. Richard started criticizing small things, the way I dressed, the kids, how I organized the pantry, the tone I used when speaking to his mother, always under the guise of just trying to help. If I got upset, I was overreacting or being too sensitive. Classic gaslighting, though I didn't know to call it that then. The criticism escalated to control. Richard insisted on managing all our finances, reasonable given his profession, I thought. He questioned every purchase I made, started checking my phone, claiming he was just using it to look something up, but somehow always ending up scrolling through my messages. He'd make comments about my friends, subtle at first, then more direct, until eventually I stopped calling them rather than deal with his disapproval. By the time Lily was 10 and Max was 7, I barely recognized myself. The confident woman, who had once coordinated massive events, was now second-guessing whether she was loading the dishwasher correctly. I'd become smaller, quieter, always calculating how to avoid Richard's displeasure. The children noticed, of course. Children always do. Max started having stomach aches before Richard came home from work. Lily became withdrawn, spending more time in her room. Once, when Richard was criticizing me about the house being messy, I saw her watching from the hallway, her small face a mirror of my own anxiety. That night, after tucking them in, I sat on the edge of my bathtub and realized something had to change. Not just for me, but for them. They were learning that love looked like walking on eggshells, that a man was allowed to make a woman feel worthless. That power imbalance was normal. I couldn't let that be their blueprint for relationships. I started small. Applied for a part-time job at a local bookstore without telling Richard. Opened a separate bank account where I deposited my paychecks. Reconnected with my sister Kate, who I'd drifted away from because Richard found her too opinionated. Began documenting Richard's behavior in a journal I kept hidden in my car. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He noticed the changes, of course. The arguments grew worse. He'd explode over nothing, then apologize profusely, claiming stress from work. The cycle became predictable. Tension, explosion, remorse, temporary peace. Classic abuse pattern, as my therapist would later explain. The breaking point came on Lily's 13th birthday. Richard had promised to be home for her special dinner. She'd requested homemade lasagna, a recipe from my grandmother that I spent all day preparing. 6 o'clock came and went. 7 o'clock. 8. No call, no text. Lily sat at the decorated table, trying not to look disappointed as the candles on her cake melted down. When Richard finally walked in at 9:30, he didn't apologize. Instead, he said, "You should have waited for me to start dinner." As if we were the ones who'd done something wrong. That night, after the kids were in bed, I told him I wanted a divorce. He laughed. Actually laughed in my face. "With what money?" he asked. "No judge is going to give you custody when you can barely support yourself. I'll make sure of it." The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. By noon, our joint bank accounts had been emptied. By evening, I discovered he'd been planning this for months, meeting with lawyers, documenting every parenting mistake I'd ever made, building a case against me while sleeping beside me every night. The following year was a nightmare of legal meetings, temporary custody arrangements, and financial panic. Richard used every advantage: his money, his connections, his charm in public settings. He portrayed himself as the stable, successful parent while painting me as emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible. Worst of all, he started manipulating the children, buying them expensive gifts during his visitation weekends, making promises about the amazing new rooms they'd have in his house once the divorce is finalized, subtly questioning them about what happened at my apartment, the small 2-bedroom I'd had to rent after being forced to leave our family home. With Lily, his tactics were particularly insidious. He'd tell her she was the woman of the house. Now, when she visited him, he'd confide in her, adult to adult, about how worried he was about me. He bought her first cell phone without consulting me, telling her she could call him anytime she felt unsafe at my place. Max, only 9, was more obviously affected. He'd come back from weekends with Richard withdrawn and anxious. Once, after Richard had kept him up until midnight watching scary movies, something I never allowed, Max crawled into my bed in tears. "Dad says you make me soft," he whispered. "He says when I live with him full time, I'll learn to be a real man." I documented everything, every concerning comment the children reported, every time Richard was late for pickup or drop-off, every unexplained change in the kid's behavior after being with him. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, Sandra, who was working for a reduced fee because she specialized in domestic abuse cases. "This is good," she told me, reviewing my notes, "but judges want concrete evidence. With Richard's resources and community standing, it's going to be an uphill battle." She was right. In our first court appearance, Richard's expensive attorney portrayed him as a devoted father unjustly separated from his children by my vindictive actions. He had character witnesses, colleagues, neighbors, even our former pediatrician, all testifying to what a dedicated family man he was. When my turn came, Sandra presented my documentation, but it seemed flimsy against Richard's polished defense. I had my sister's testimony about the controlling behavior she'd witnessed, but Richard's lawyer easily dismissed her as biased. I had my therapist's professional assessment of the emotional abuse I'd endured, but it was countered by a psychologist Richard had hired who questioned my mental stability based on a single meeting. Through it all, Richard sat there looking appropriately concerned, occasionally shaking his head sadly at my delusions. The judge, an older man who seemed more interested in clearing his docket than digging for truth, clearly favored Richard's side. When we broke for lunch that day, Sandra pulled me aside. "This isn't going well," she admitted. "Judge Harmon is old school. He sees a successful businessman versus a part-time bookstore employee. We need something concrete." I remember staring at her, fighting back tears. "Like what? Richard is too smart to leave evidence. That's how emotional abuse works. It leaves marks no one can see." That afternoon, the judge ordered a temporary custody arrangement. The children would spend weekdays with me, weekends with Richard, while the court considered the case. It could have been worse, but I knew Richard wouldn't stop there. He wanted total control of the narrative, of the children, of me. The next few months were a delicate balance. I tried to maintain normalcy for Lily and Max while preparing for what I knew would be a difficult final custody hearing. I picked up extra shifts at the bookstore. I attended support groups for divorced mothers. I made sure homework was done, meals were healthy, and the apartment, small as it was, felt like home. Richard, meanwhile, escalated his campaign. He'd send me dozens of texts questioning my parenting decisions. He started recording our interactions at pickup and drop-off, hoping to catch me looking emotional or unstable. Once he brought his mother to an exchange, and she loudly commented on how tired and unprofessional I looked in my bookstore uniform. The kids were caught in the middle, though I tried desperately to shield them. Max started having nightmares. Lily's grades slipped. Their teachers called, concerned about their focus and emotional well-being. One Tuesday evening, about 2 weeks before our final custody hearing, I came home from work to find Lily sitting on our small balcony, staring out at nothing. Max was already asleep. He'd been having trouble staying awake through the day, exhausted from his nightmares. I sat beside Lily, not speaking at first. At 14, she'd grown so much in the past year. Not just physically, but in maturity. She'd had to. "Bad day?" I finally asked. She didn't look at me. "Dad called me during lunch period." My stomach tightened. Richard knew he wasn't supposed to contact the kids during school hours. It was one of the few boundaries the temporary custody agreement had established. What did he want? Lily pulled her knees to her chest. "He said after the hearing we probably wouldn't be living with you anymore." that it would be better for everyone. Her voice cracked. He said you weren't fit to take care of us. That you never were. I felt that familiar mix of rage and helplessness. Richard was poisoning our children against me, and the court seemed blind to it. Lily, you know that's not. I know, Mom. She finally looked at me, her eyes older than they should have been. I know who you are, and I know who he is too. Something in her tone made me pause. What do you mean? Lily reached for her phone, the one Richard had given her. I've been recording him, she said quietly. When he says these things. When he thinks no one's listening. She handed me the phone, her hand trembling slightly. I think you should hear this. I pressed play on the first recording. Richard's voice filled the quiet evening air, smooth and articulate as always, but his words sent chills down my spine. Once I get full custody, things will be different, Lily. Your mother won't be able to fill your head with her emotional garbage anymore. We'll fix all the damage she's done to you and Max. I listened to recording after recording. Richard telling Lily that I was mentally unstable. Richard coaching Max on what to say if a court representative asked about me. Richard on the phone with someone, his lawyer presumably, discussing how to make sure Amanda looks incompetent at the final hearing. The last recording was the worst. Richard, voice slightly slurred from what sounded like several drinks, saying, I don't even want the kids full time. That's what nannies are for. But I'll be damned if I let your mother think she won anything in this divorce. When the recordings ended, I sat in stunned silence. Here was the evidence we needed, Richard in his own words, revealing his true motivations, the manipulation, the lies. Lily watched me process it all, her expression a mix of guilt and relief. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, she whispered. I was scared. I pulled her into a hug, my brave, resilient daughter who had found a way to fight back when all the adults in her life had failed her. You have nothing to be sorry for, I told her. Nothing at all. The next morning, I called Sandra and explained what Lily had discovered. She was cautiously optimistic, but warned me about potential issues. Recording someone without their knowledge can be legally problematic in some states, she explained. But if Lily made these recordings as a minor in her father's care, with concerns about her own well-being, we might have something we can use. Sandra consulted with colleagues and determined that in our state, the recordings could be admissible given the circumstances, a minor documenting potential emotional abuse. She filed an emergency motion to include the new evidence in our upcoming hearing. Richard's lawyer fought it, of course. There were emergency phone calls, legal objections, attempts to have the recordings suppressed. But Judge Harmon, to his credit, agreed to at least listen to them before making a decision on their admissibility. Which brings us back to that day in court. The day the judge said I'd lose my kids. The day Lily stood up and changed everything. After Lily mentioned the recording, Judge Harmon called both attorneys to approach the bench. There was heated whispering, gesturing Richard's attorney looking increasingly agitated. Finally, the judge spoke. I'm going to take a 15-minute recess to review some new evidence in my chambers. Court is adjourned temporarily. Those 15 minutes were the longest of my life. Lily sat beside me, bouncing her leg nervously. Max, who was waiting outside with my sister, had no idea what was happening. Richard sat at his table, no longer smirking, his face a mask of controlled fury. When Judge Harmon returned, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. He looked at Richard differently, not with the professional respect he'd shown earlier, but with something closer to disgust. Having reviewed the recordings provided by the minor child, I find sufficient cause for concern regarding Mr. Sullivan's intentions and behavior, he announced. Before making any final custody determination, I am ordering a full investigation by Family Services, including interviews with both children in a neutral setting. Richard shot to his feet. Your Honor, those recordings were obtained illegally. My daughter was manipulated into Mr. Sullivan, the judge interrupted, his voice sharp. I strongly advise you to remain silent at this time. The content of these recordings raises serious questions about your fitness as a parent, regardless of how they were obtained. He turned to me. Mrs. Sullivan, my preliminary ruling on custody is rescinded pending the completion of this investigation. The current temporary arrangement will remain in place. I barely heard the rest of what he said. All I could focus on was that my children weren't being taken from me. Not today, not yet, maybe not ever if the investigation uncovered the truth. As we left the courtroom, Richard tried to approach Lily. For the first time in our entire relationship, I stepped directly in his path. Don't, I said, my voice steady. Not today. He stared at me, that familiar anger flickering behind his eyes, but there were too many witnesses, bailiffs, court reporters, other families waiting for their hearings. This isn't over, he said quietly. You're right, I replied. It's just beginning. I took Lily's hand, and together we walked out to meet Max and Kate. As we stepped into the sunlight, Lily looked up at me. Did I do the right thing? I squeezed her hand. You did the brave thing, and sometimes that's the same thing. That night, we ordered pizza and watched a movie together, some silly comedy that made Max laugh so hard he got hiccups. It wasn't a celebration, exactly. We all knew there were difficult days ahead, but it was a moment of peace after months of storm. The investigation took 6 weeks. Family Services interviewed both children multiple times. They reviewed the recordings, my documentation, school records, and interviewed friends and family members. They observed Richard's interactions with the kids during supervised visits, another temporary measure the judge had ordered after hearing the recordings. What they found confirmed everything I had known but couldn't prove. Richard's manipulation, his prioritizing of his own needs over the children's well-being, his disturbing pattern of parentifying Lily and undermining Max's sense of security. The final custody hearing was nothing like the first. The Family Services report painted a clear picture of Richard's behavior and its impact on our children. The judge, now fully informed, awarded me primary physical and legal custody. Richard received limited visitation, initially supervised, with mandatory parenting classes and therapy. As we left the courthouse, truly free for the first time in years, Kate wrapped an arm around my shoulders. How does it feel to win? She asked. I watched Lily and Max walking ahead of us, heads together, laughing about something. It doesn't feel like winning, I said. It feels like surviving. And that's what we've been doing ever since. Surviving, healing, rebuilding. It hasn't been easy. Richard fought the ruling initially, filing appeals that went nowhere. Eventually, he moved across the country for a new job and a new relationship. His calls to the kids became less frequent, his visits rare. Part of me mourns the father they deserved but never had. Most of me is just relieved. Lily is 17 now, preparing for college. She wants to study law, inspired, she says, by seeing how it can protect people when used correctly. Max is 14, slowly overcoming his anxiety, discovering a passion for photography. They're not unmarked by what they experienced, but they're resilient in ways I never had to be at their ages. As for me, I'm no longer just surviving. I managed to get a full-time position coordinating events for the public library system. Work I love that also pays the bills. I've rebuilt friendships that withered under Richard's influence. I've even started dating again, cautiously. A kind man who understands that trust takes time to grow. Some people ask if I'm angry about what happened, if I hate Richard for what he put us through. The truth is, anger takes energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. What I feel is sadness for the man who had a family who loved him and couldn't value. In pity for someone so controlled by his need for control that he lost everything that mattered. But mostly, I feel gratitude. For my children's courage. For a legal system that eventually worked, however imperfectly, for the chance to show Lily and Max that speaking truth, even when your voice shakes, even when no one wants to hear it, is the most powerful thing you can do. If you're watching this and something in my story resonates with you, if you're trapped in a situation where you're made to doubt your own reality, please know this. You are not crazy. Your feelings are valid, and there is a way forward, even when all paths seem blocked. That recording Lily made didn't just save our family. It taught us all that sometimes the smallest actions can tip the scales of justice, that even when the system is stacked against you, truth has a power all its own. Richard took our security, our home, nearly our hope. But in the end, I got my children. Not because a judge granted them to me like prizes, but because they chose truth over comfort. They chose courage over silence. They chose love, real love, not the controlling imitation Richard offered, over fear. And every day, I try to be worthy of that choice. The weeks following that first court hearing felt like walking on a tightrope, balanced between hope and terror, never quite sure when the next gust of wind would send us tumbling. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., heart pounding, replaying the judge's words, in my head, pending the completion of this investigation. Nothing was certain yet. Richard still had resources, connections, the ability to charm and manipulate. The investigation could still swing in his favor if we weren't careful. The day after the hearing, I called in sick to the bookstore. I needed to be home, to create a sense of stability for Lily and Max, to let them know that their world wasn't about to be upended again. Max stayed home from school too, complaining of another stomachache. I didn't push it. Some lessons are more important than perfect attendance, and learning that your home is a safe place is one of them. We made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, Max's favorite, and ate them on the living room floor while watching cartoons, something I rarely allowed on school days. Lily joined us, though I could tell she was distracted, checking her phone constantly, jumping whenever it buzzed. "He hasn't texted," she said finally, setting the phone down. "Dad, he usually sends me messages all day when I'm with you." Carefully kept my expression neutral. "How do you feel about that?" She shrugged, pushing a piece of pancake around her plate. "Relieved, I guess, but also kind of waiting. Like when there's a thunderstorm coming and everything gets really quiet first." Her description was perfect, that eerie stillness before the storm breaks. Richard wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. He was regrouping, planning his next move. It came that afternoon in the form of his mother, Eleanor, showing up unannounced at our apartment door. Eleanor Sullivan was a formidable woman, tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of refined manners that somehow made you feel perpetually judged. She'd never approved of me. The event planner from a middle-class family wasn't good enough for her only son. "Amanda," she said coolly when I opened the door, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. Her eyes swept over our modest living room, taking in the pancake plates still on the coffee table, the cartoons still playing on TV. "I see you're maintaining your usual standards of housekeeping." I bit back a retort. Eleanor had never been on my side, but she was the children's grandmother. They loved her, despite her flaws. "What can I help you with, Eleanor?" I asked. Instead, she set her designer purse on our kitchen counter. "I've come to speak to Lily, privately." "That's not happening," I said immediately. "Not without discussing why first." "I hardly think you're in a position to make demands," she replied. "Richard has told me everything about what happened in court yesterday. Using a child to record private conversations. I'm ashamed you would sink so low." Before I could respond, Lily appeared in the hallway. "I recorded Dad because he was lying, Grandma," she said, her voice small but firm. "No one asked me to do it. I decided myself." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. She'd always had a soft spot for Lily, who, reminded her of Richard as a child. "Darling, you're too young to understand adult matters. Your father is devastated that you've been manipulated this way." "I'm 14, Lily replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "I'm old enough to know when someone is telling the truth, and when they're not." Eleanor's lips thinned into a disapproving line. "Perhaps we should discuss this another time, when you're feeling more reasonable." She turned to me. "Richard will be contacting your lawyer about an appeal. He's also considering filing charges related to the illegal recordings." My heart sank, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's welcome to try. But the judge has heard. Those recordings now, Eleanor. The truth is out." "Truth is subjective," she said dismissively. She looked past me to Lily. "Your father loves you very much, remember that." After she left, I found Lily in her room, curled on her bed with her laptop open. "You okay?" I asked, sitting on the edge of the mattress. She nodded without looking up. "Grandma's always been like that. She thinks Dad can do no wrong. Family loyalty is important to her," I said carefully, trying to be fair despite my feelings about Eleanor. "It's not loyalty if you help someone. Hurt people," Lily replied, closing her laptop. "That's just being part of the problem." I stared at my daughter, wondering when she'd grown so wise. "When did you decide to start recording your dad?" I asked, a question that had been nagging at me. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Remember last Thanksgiving? When he took us to his place instead of going to Aunt Kate's?" I nodded. It had been one of many holidays Richard had disrupted, insisting on exercising his visitation rights during family gatherings I'd planned. "He got really angry that night," she continued. "Max spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth, and Dad just exploded. Called him useless, clumsy, said he was doing it on purpose to ruin dinner." Her voice grew smaller. "Max cried, and Dad told him to stop being a baby, said he was embarrassing himself." My heart ached thinking of Max, just 9. Years old, being berated for an accident. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Dad made us promise not to. Said you'd just use it against him in court." She picked at a loose thread on her comforter. "But that night, after Max fell asleep, I heard Dad on the phone with someone. He was laughing about how he'd ruined your Thanksgiving by taking us. Said it was just the beginning of making sure you lost everything." She looked up at me, her eyes too old for her face. "That's when I knew he didn't really want us. We were just weapons to hurt you with. So I started recording. Just in case." I pulled her into a hug, fighting back tears. My child had been carrying this burden alone, trying to protect her brother, trying to gather evidence, trying to be the adult when the adults in her life were failing her. "You shouldn't have had to do that," I whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry you were put in that position." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm not. If I hadn't, we might have had to live with him. And Mom." She hesitated. "I don't think Max would have survived that. Not really." The gravity of her words hit me like a physical blow. Max, my sensitive son who felt everything so deeply, who was already struggling with anxiety and nightmares. What would full-time exposure to Richard's emotional abuse have done to him? That night, after both kids were asleep, I called Sandra to tell her about Eleanor's visit and Richard's threatened appeal. "Let him try," she said confidently. "Those recordings are powerful evidence. The judge has ordered a full investigation. Based on what he heard, that doesn't happen without serious concerns about a child's welfare." "But could Richard really file charges over the recordings?" I asked, voicing my biggest fear. "It's complicated," Sandra admitted. "But given that Lily made them herself as a minor, documenting what she perceived as emotional abuse, and given that they've already been heard by the judge, I think we're on solid ground." Not to mention, filing charges would only draw more attention to what's on those recordings, which is the last thing Richard wants. Her reassurance helped, but sleep still eluded me that night. I kept thinking about what Lily had said about Max not surviving life with Richard. Not physically, but emotionally. The bright, curious spark that made him who he was would have been systematically extinguished. The family services investigation began the following week. A social worker named Diane was assigned to our case. No-nonsense woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct manner that the kids responded well to. She interviewed each of us separately, then together, observing our interactions and asking questions about our daily routines. "Max, what happens when you make a mistake at home?" she asked during one session. Max, sitting cross-legged on our living room floor, shrugged. "Depends what kind of mistake. If I spill something, Mom helps me clean it up. If I forget my homework, I have to call a classmate to get the assignment." "And what about at your dad's house?" His demeanor changed instantly, shoulders hunching, eyes dropping to the floor. "Dad gets mad. Says I don't pay attention. Sometimes he makes me write what I did wrong like 50 times so I remember not to do it again." Diane made a note, her expression neutral. "And how does that make you feel?" "Small," Max said after a long pause. "Like I'm always doing everything wrong." Each session was like this, peeling back layers of the children's experiences, revealing the stark differences between life in my home and life with Richard. Diane reviewed school records, spoke to teachers, interviewed Kate and even Eleanor, who, according to Kate's neighbor who worked at Family Services, had been aggressively unhelpful. Through it all, Richard maintained his campaign. Though he was now limited to supervised visitation, he used every opportunity to undermine me. He'd send the kids home with expensive gifts I couldn't afford, then text to ask why they weren't using them. He'd question my parenting decisions in front of the supervision monitor, making comments like, "I'm surprised your mother lets you eat that much sugar," or, "Don't worry, when this is all sorted out, we'll get you proper tutoring." The supervisor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patel, documented everything. "He doesn't seem to realize I'm actually listening," she told me once as she dropped the kids off. "Or maybe he's so used to behaving this way that he doesn't even recognize it as inappropriate anymore." 3 weeks into the investigation, Diane requested a meeting with just me. We sat at my kitchen table while the kids were at school, mugs of coffee between us. "I want to be transparent with you, Amanda," she said. "What I'm seeing is a clear pattern of emotional manipulation and control from Richard. The recordings Lily made are consistent with behaviors I've observed and what the children have reported." Relief flooded through me, but Diane wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "Richard is very skilled at presenting himself well to authority figures. He's charming, articulate, and comes across as reasonable, at least initially, and he has a lot of community support. His colleagues, his mother, even your former neighbors have all provided glowing character references." My hope deflated. "So it's his word against ours again." Diane shook her head. "No, it's his word against evidence, against patterns of behavior I've observed firsthand, against the developmental regression I'm seeing in Max. But," she sighed, "family court cases are complex. Judges have tremendous discretion." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my report will strongly recommend that you retain primary custody, with Richard having limited supervised visitation until he completes therapy and parenting classes." She met my eyes directly. "But I'm also saying you should prepare yourself for a fight. Richard doesn't strike me as someone who gives up easily." She was right. The following day, I received notice that Richard had filed an emergency motion challenging the impartiality of the Family Services investigation. He claimed Diane was biased against him, that she had a feminist agenda, and that she had coached the children on what to say. It was a desperate move, but one that delayed the process. The The court had to review his claims, schedule another hearing, create more hoops for us to jump through. It was Richard's strategy. Drag things out, wear me down financially and emotionally, force me to give up or compromise just to end the ordeal. But he had underestimated one critical factor: how much stronger adversity had made me. The woman I was at the beginning of my marriage, eager to please, conflict avoidant, willing to shrink myself to fit someone else's expectations, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to fight, not just for herself, but for her children. Someone who had discovered reserves of resilience she never knew existed. I picked up extra shifts at the bookstore. I applied for a small loan to cover legal fees. I reached out to a local domestic violence support group where I found not just emotional support but practical assistance. Women who would watch the kids when I had court appearances, who knew which community resources could help with bills, who understood exactly what I was going through because they'd lived it themselves. One woman in particular, Vivian, became a lifeline. She'd been through a similar custody battle with her ex-husband, a man who, like Richard, presented one face to the world and another at home. The hardest part, she told me over coffee one morning, is that most people can't comprehend it. They think, well, he seems so nice, so reasonable. Surely she must be exaggerating. They don't understand that the charm is part of the abuse. Exactly, I said, relieved to be truly understood. The judge in our first hearing clearly thought I was being dramatic. Vivian nodded. The system isn't designed to recognize emotional abuse. It looks for bruises, broken bones, concrete evidence, not the invisible wounds that can be just as damaging. So, how did you win? I asked, desperate for hope. She smiled grimly. I documented everything, built a case so compelling they couldn't ignore it. And I refused to back down, even when everyone, my parents, my friends, even my first lawyer, told me to compromise for the sake of the children. Her eyes hardened, as if exposing my kids to their father's manipulation was somehow in their best interest. I took her advice to heart. I started keeping even more detailed records. I recorded Max's nightmares, noting their frequency and intensity after visits with Richard. I documented Lily's anxiety symptoms, the nail biting, the hair twirling, the stomach aches before scheduled visits. I kept copies of all of Richard's texts, emails, and voicemails, highlighting the manipulative language and veiled threats. I also worked with the kids' therapist, Dr. Chen, to help them develop healthy coping mechanisms. Max learned breathing techniques to manage his anxiety. Lily practiced setting boundaries, even role-playing conversations with her father where she calmly refused to discuss me or act as his messenger. You're doing remarkably well, Dr. Chen told me during one of our parent consultations. Many parents in your situation become so focused on the legal battle that they lose sight of the day-to-day emotional needs of their children. You haven't. Her words gave me strength on the darkest days. The days when Richard's latest legal maneuver seemed to be working, when the money was running out, when the kids came home from a supervised visit withdrawn and quiet. The hearing on Richard's emergency motion finally arrived 6 weeks after he filed it. It was scheduled for a Thursday morning, which meant I had to miss another shift at the bookstore. More income lost, more explaining to my manager, who was supportive but running a business with limited staff. The courtroom was the same as before, but this time I walked in differently, head high, shoulders back, prepared. Sandra had prepped me thoroughly. Richard's motion was legally flimsy, a delay tactic rather than a substantive challenge, but we needed to treat it seriously nonetheless. Richard and his attorney were already seated when we arrived. He wore an expensive suit and a concerned expression, the devoted father wrongfully accused. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw a flicker of surprise at my composure. He was used to the Amanda who would have been intimidated by this setting, who would have arrived flustered and apologetic. That Amanda was gone. Judge Harmon entered, looking tired but focused. He reviewed the motion briefly, then looked up at Richard's attorney with barely concealed impatience. "Counselor, you're alleging investigator bias based on what evidence?" "Exactly?" Richard's attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Prescott, stood. "Your Honor, my client has documented multiple instances where the Family Services investigator, Ms. Diane Wells, demonstrated clear bias in her questioning and interactions. She focused disproportionately on alleged negative incidents at Mr. Sullivan's home while dismissing similar concerns about Mrs. Sullivan's parenting." Sandra stood next. "Your Honor, these allegations are completely unfounded. Ms. Wells has an exemplary record spanning 23 years with Family Services. The incidents Mr. Sullivan refers to are simply moments when his own behavior was appropriately documented. This motion is nothing more than an attempt to delay the proceedings and undermine a thorough, professional investigation." Judge Harmon nodded, then turned to Richard. "Mr. Sullivan, are you personally alleging that Ms. Wells coached your children or misrepresented their statements?" Richard straightened, adopting his most earnest expression. "Yes, Your Honor. My children behave very differently with me than what's described in her preliminary reports. I believe they've been influenced to make negative statements about our relationship." "Influenced by whom?" the judge asked. "By their mother," Richard replied smoothly. "And potentially by Ms. Wells, who seems to have formed a negative opinion of me from the outset." I felt a surge of anger, but kept my face neutral. Richard was using one of his favorite tactics, projecting his own behaviors onto others. He was the one who coached the children, who pressured them to present a certain image, who manipulated their statements. Judge Harmon was silent for a moment, reviewing the papers before him. Then he looked up, his gaze direct and unyielding. "Mr. Sullivan, I've reviewed the qualifications and history of Ms. Wells. I find no evidence of bias or unprofessional conduct. Furthermore, the court appointed Ms. Wells specifically because of her extensive experience in cases involving alleged emotional manipulation." He paused. "Your motion is denied. The investigation will continue as ordered." Richard's face flushed with anger, but he quickly composed himself. "Your Honor, I request an independent secondary evaluation then. Surely that's a reasonable accommodation to ensure fairness." The judge considered this. "I'll allow a secondary evaluation, but—" He held up a hand as Richard began to look triumphant. "It will be conducted by Dr. Michael Reeves, the court's independent psychologist, and Mr. Sullivan, you will bear the full cost of this additional evaluation." It was a small victory. Richard had failed to discredit Diane, and while he'd succeeded in adding another layer to the process, it would be conducted by a court-appointed expert, not someone his money could influence. As we left the courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The system, slow and imperfect as it was, seemed to be working. Judge Harmon had seen through Richard's tactics. Sandra squeezed my arm encouragingly. "That went as well as we could have hoped. Judge Harmon is no fool. He sees what Richard is doing." "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now Dr. Reeves will conduct his evaluation, which will likely take another few weeks. But Amanda," she smiled, "this is good news. Independent evaluations often uncover even more than the initial investigation, especially when children are being manipulated." Richard may have just shot himself in the foot. As we walked toward the parking lot, I spotted Richard and Ms. Prescott in intense conversation by his luxury car. He looked up as we passed, his expression cold. "This isn't over," he called out, just loud enough for me to hear. I paused, considering my response. The old Amanda would have hurried past, pretending not to hear, avoiding confrontation at all costs. Instead, I turned to face him directly. "You're right," I said calmly. "It's not over. But it will be soon, and our children deserve that peace." I walked away before he could respond, feeling stronger with each step. There would be more battles ahead. Richard wouldn't give up easily. But, for the first time, I truly believed we would win. Not just the legal fight, but the deeper struggle to break free from Richard's control and create a life where Lily and Max could flourish, unburdened by his manipulation and emotional abuse. As I drove home, I thought about how far we'd come. A year ago, I was still walking on eggshells in my own home, still doubting my own perceptions, still believing on some level that I deserved Richard's criticism and control. Now, I was fighting for custody of my children in court, standing up to Richard and his high-priced attorney, rebuilding a life on my own terms. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had come in small moments of courage. The first time I contradicted Richard in front of the children, the day I applied for a job without asking his permission, the night I finally said, "Enough," and asked for a divorce. Each small act of bravery had built upon the last, creating a foundation strong enough to support not just me, but Lily and Max as well. When I arrived home, Kate was there with the kids, helping Max with his science project, while Lily worked on homework at the kitchen table. The apartment was filled with the smell of the lasagna Kate had put in the oven, our grandmother's recipe, a small tradition we were reclaiming. "How did it go?" Kate asked, her eyes anxious. I smiled, genuine and relieved. "We won this round. There's more ahead, but we're getting there." Max looked up from his project, a solar system model made of painted styrofoam balls. "Is Dad still mad?" he asked quietly. I sat down beside him, choosing my words carefully. "Your dad is upset about some things right now, but that's not your problem to fix, okay? That's grown-up stuff." He nodded, but I could see the worry still etched in his small face. "Will we still see him on Saturday?" "Yes, with Mrs. Patel, just like before." I helped him position Saturn on its wire support. "And you can talk to Dr. Chen about how those visits make you feel, remember?" I remember. He concentrated on attaching a tiny moon to its orbit. "I like Dr. Chen. She doesn't make me feel stupid when I get scared." My heart ached at his words. Such a simple expectation, to not be made to feel stupid for having feelings, yet one Richard had never met. Across the room, Lily caught my eye. She'd been listening while pretending to focus on her algebra. "It's getting better, isn't it?" she asked, her voice tentative but hopeful. I looked around our small apartment, at Max's science project sprawling across the coffee table, at Lily's textbooks and notebooks covering half the kitchen table, at Kate chopping salad for dinner, at the family photos I'd finally put up on the walls after months of feeling too temporary to bother. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what I'd imagined for us when I was younger. But it was real, and it was ours, and it was free from Richard's shadow. "Yes," I told her, believing it completely for the first time. "It's getting better." Dr. Michael Reeves was nothing like I expected. Based on Richard's smug expression after the hearing, I'd imagined someone intimidating, perhaps an older man with conservative views who might be sympathetic to Richard's concerned father act. Instead, Dr. Reeves was a soft-spoken black man. In his early 50s with reading glasses perpetually perched on top of his head and a gentle manner that immediately put the children at ease. "My job," he explained during our first meeting, "is not to take sides or make judgments about either parent. I'm here to assess what environment best serves these children's emotional and psychological well-being." We sat in his office, a warm space with comfortable furniture, children's artwork on the walls, and a corner filled with toys and books for younger clients. Max immediately gravitated toward a shelf of fidget toys, selecting a squishy ball that he needed throughout our conversation. "Can I say anything I want?" Lily asked, her expression guarded. "Even if it's bad?" Dr. Reeves nodded. "Especially if it feels bad. Those are often the most important things to discuss." He glanced at me. "Mrs. Sullivan, after this initial meeting, I'll be speaking with the children privately. I'll also observe them with each parent separately and review all the documentation. from the case so far. I understand, I said, trying to hide my anxiety. I trusted my children to tell the truth, but Richard was so skilled at manipulation. What if he convinced them to present a different story to Dr. Reeves? As if reading my thoughts, Dr. Reeves added, I've been doing this work for 27 years. I've learned to look beyond what children say to what they show through their behavior, their body language, their emotional responses. The truth has a way of revealing itself. His words reassured me, but the next few weeks were still agonizing. The children attended sessions with Dr. Reeves 3 times a week. They never shared details about these meetings, and I never asked, wanting to respect the safe space he was creating for them. Meanwhile, Richard stepped up his campaign. He began sending expensive gifts directly to our apartment, a gaming system for Max, designer clothes for Lily, always with notes emphasizing that these were things I couldn't provide. When I returned them, he accused me of depriving the children, out of spite. When I didn't, he'd text the kids asking why they weren't using his gifts, making them feel guilty either way. His supervised visits became exercises in subtle undermining. He'd bring Eleanor, who would make comments about the children looking underfed or tired, implying neglect. He'd ask pointed questions about their schoolwork, suggesting I wasn't helping them enough. He'd promise future trips and experiences once this mess is sorted out, creating an image of a wonderful life waiting just beyond my interference. Mrs. Patel documented everything, but the constant pressure took its toll. Max's nightmares returned. Lily became withdrawn, spending more time alone in her room. I felt helpless, watching Richard's tactics work even under supervision, unable to shield them completely. One evening, after a particularly difficult visit where Richard had spent the entire time showing the kids photos of a beach house he'd rented for our first family vacation once I get custody, I found Lily sitting on our small balcony, knees pulled to her chest, staring into the distance. "Hey," I said softly, sitting beside her. "Tough day?" She nodded, not looking at me. "Dad says we'll be living with him by Christmas, that the judge is just going through the motions now." My stomach clenched, but I kept my voice steady. "Your dad doesn't know what the judge will decide. No one does yet." "But what if he's right?" Lily turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What if all of this was for nothing? The recordings, the investigation, everything?" I considered my answer carefully. "Lily, standing up for the truth is never for nothing. Even if things don't go the way we hope, and I believe they will, what you did took incredible courage. That matters, regardless of the outcome." She wiped at her eyes. "I'm just so tired of all of it. The visits, the questions, everyone wanting something from us." "I know, sweetheart." I put my arm around her shoulders and she leaned into me, a small miracle, given how teenagers typically avoid parental affection. "But you know what? We're going to be okay, whatever happens." "How can you be so sure?" I smiled. "Because we've already survived the worst parts. We're not living in fear anymore. We're not pretending. We're just us, messy and real and figuring it out together." She considered this, then asked, "What if Dr. Reeves doesn't believe us?" "Dr. Reeves isn't looking for who to believe," I explained. "He's observing how you and Max actually feel and behave with each of us. Those feelings are real, and they matter." Lily was quiet for a moment. "I feel like I can breathe when I'm here," she finally said. "With Dad, it's like I'm always performing, being the daughter he wants instead of just me." Her words struck me deeply, not just for their insight, but because they reflected exactly how I'd felt during my marriage. Always performing, never authentic, constantly trying to be the version of myself that would avoid Richard's disapproval. "I think Dr. Reeves will see that," I told her. "And it's one of the most important things for him to know." The next day, I received a call from Sandra. Dr. Reeves has requested a meeting with both you and Richard separately. He's completed his evaluation and wants to discuss his findings before submitting his report to the court. My appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon. I arranged for Kate to pick up the kids from school, then spent the morning at the bookstore, grateful for the distraction of shelving new arrivals and helping customers find the perfect read. My manager, Denise, had been extraordinarily supportive throughout the custody battle, flexing my schedule around court dates and appointments, even creating a small display of books about resilience and overcoming adversity that always made me smile when I passed it. "Big day?" she asked, noticing my distraction as I reorganized the same shelf of mystery novels for the third time. "Meeting with the court psychologist," I explained. "He's finished his evaluation." She squeezed my shoulder. "Whatever happens, remember how far you've come. The woman who started working here a year ago barely made eye contact with customers. Now look at you, running author events, managing the children's section, standing up for yourself in court. That strength doesn't disappear no matter what," some report says. Her perspective helped center me as I drove to Dr. Reeves' office that afternoon. Whatever happened next, I wasn't the same person Richard had controlled for so long. I wouldn't break, even if things didn't go my way. Dr. Reeves welcomed me with a warm handshake and gestured to the chair across from his desk. The office felt different without the children present, more formal, with the weight of decisions hanging in the air. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, "I want to thank you for your cooperation throughout this process. I know it hasn't been easy." I nodded, too nervous to speak. "I've completed my evaluation and will be submitting my report to Judge Harmon tomorrow," he continued. "While I can't share all the details, I believe you should understand my key findings." He opened a file on his desk, glancing at his notes. First, both Lily and Max show signs of what we call an anxious attachment pattern in relation to their father. They're hypervigilant around him, constantly monitoring his mood, adjusting their behavior to avoid disapproval, suppressing their authentic emotional responses. My heart raced. This was exactly what I'd observed but struggled to articulate to the court. "With you," he continued, "they display a secure attachment pattern. They're relaxed, expressive, comfortable, showing a range of emotions, including negative ones without fear of rejection." He removed his glasses, his expression serious. "Mrs. Sullivan, in cases like yours, it's often difficult to provide concrete evidence of emotional manipulation and psychological control. These dynamics leave no visible bruises, no documentation from emergency rooms or police reports, but they leave profound marks on children's development and emotional well-being." "So you believe what we've been saying?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. "My observations align with the concerns raised by Ms. Wells in her initial investigation. The recordings Lily made also corroborate a pattern of behavior that's inconsistent with healthy parenting." He folded his hands on the desk. "I'll be recommending that you retain primary physical custody, with Mr. Sullivan having limited, supervised visitation contingent upon his completion of a specialized parenting program focused on emotional abuse and manipulation." Relief flooded through me so powerfully I felt lightheaded. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for seeing what was happening." Dr. Reeves shook his head. "Don't thank me, Mrs. Sullivan. This isn't a favor. It's my professional assessment, based on extensive observation. And it's important you understand that my recommendation, while significant, is just one factor the judge will consider." I nodded, trying to temper my optimism. "Has Richard been informed of your findings?" "I met with him this morning." Dr. Reeves's expression remained neutral, but something in his tone shifted. "He disagreed with my assessment." I could imagine Richard's reaction, the controlled anger, the questioning of Dr. Reeves's qualifications, the thinly veiled threats of appeals and complaints to licensing boards. "What happens next?" I asked. "Judge Harmon has scheduled a hearing for next Monday to review both my report and Ms. Wells's findings." Both you and Mr. Sullivan will have the opportunity to address the court before he makes his final custody determination. One more hearing. One more chance for Richard to charm and manipulate. The anxiety must have shown on my face because Dr. Reeves leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Sullivan, may I offer some advice? Not as a court-appointed evaluator, but as someone who's witnessed hundreds of these cases over my career? I nodded eagerly. The most powerful testimony doesn't come from attacking the other parent or defending yourself. It comes from honestly expressing what your children need and why you're committed to providing it. His eyes were kind, but serious. Judge Harmon will have read our reports. He'll know the concerning patterns. What he needs to see from you is authenticity, the same quality your children feel safe expressing in your presence. His words stayed with me as I drove home, as I prepared dinner, as I helped Max with his homework, and listened to Lily talk about her English project. Authenticity. For so long under Richard's control, authenticity had felt dangerous, a liability that could trigger criticism or anger. I'd learned to hide my true thoughts and feelings, to present a carefully curated version of myself designed to avoid conflict. Even during the court proceedings, I'd been measured, controlled, afraid that any display of emotion would be used against me as evidence of instability. But Dr. Reeves was suggesting something different, that my genuine self, the mother my children knew in our private moments, was exactly who needed to appear in court. The night before the hearing, after the kids were asleep, I sat at our small kitchen table with a notebook trying to organize my thoughts. What did I want to say to the judge? How could I convey what our family needed without sounding rehearsed or bitter? I started writing, crossing out, writing again. Everything sounded either too formal or too emotional, too detailed or too vague. After an hour of frustration, I pushed the notebook away and closed my eyes, asking myself a different question. If I were simply talking to another parent about my children, what would I say? The answer came easily then. I'd talk about Max's sensitivity, how he noticed everything, the way light changed throughout the day, the subtle shift in someone's tone of voice, the feelings others tried to hide. I'd share how Lily's outward confidence masked a deep need for approval, how she set impossible standards for herself, how she'd only recently started believing her opinions mattered. I'd explain how both children needed space to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to express difficult emotions without fear of rejection. I'd talk about the progress we'd made in our small apartment, the nightmares that had become less frequent, the laughter that had returned to our dinner table, the way Max no longer flinched when he spilled something, the way Lily had started speaking up more in school. And I'd acknowledge what was still healing: Max's anxiety about disappointing others, Lily's tendency to take responsibility for everyone's feelings, both children's lingering fear that their world could be upended at any moment. This was the truth I needed to share, not a performance designed to impress a judge, but the real, messy, hopeful story of our family's journey toward healing. The morning of the hearing, I woke before my alarm, a knot of anticipation in my stomach. I'd laid out my clothes the night before. A simple navy dress, professional but not pretentious. I wanted to look like myself, not a version of myself, created for Richard's approval or the court's impression. The kids were quiet at breakfast, sensing the importance of the day. "Will we find out today?" Max asked, pushing his cereal around his bowl. "If we get to stay with you?" "Probably," I answered honestly. "But whatever the judge decides, we'll handle it together, okay?" He nodded, unconvinced. Lily reached across the table and squeezed his hand, a small gesture of support that brought tears to my eyes. Through all of this, they'd grown closer, protecting each other in ways children shouldn't have to, but finding strength in their bond. Kate arrived to stay with them during the hearing. We'd decided it was better for them not to be present. They'd already spoken through their sessions with Dr. Reeves and Ms. Wells, and I wanted to spare them the tension of the courtroom. "You've got this," Kate said, hugging me tightly at the door. Just speak your truth. The courthouse seemed less intimidating this time, familiar territory now rather than a foreign landscape. Sandra met me in the lobby, her confidence bolstering. Mine. Dr. Reeves's report is extremely favorable, she assured me. Ms. Wells's findings align with his. The evidence is on our side. As we entered the courtroom, I saw Richard and Ms. Prescott already seated at their table. Richard wore an expensive suit and a solemn expression, the concerned father unfairly maligned. Our eyes met briefly, and I was surprised to find I felt nothing. Not anger, not fear, not even resentment. He had no power over me anymore. Judge Harmon entered, and we all rose. He looked tired but focused as he reviewed the papers before him, Dr. Reeves's report, Ms. Wells's findings, the file of evidence we'd submitted over the months of proceedings. I've reviewed the reports submitted by both evaluators, he began. Both raised significant concerns about Mr. Sullivan's parenting approach and its impact on the minor children. He looked at Richard directly. Mr. Sullivan, do you wish to address these findings before I hear from Mrs. Sullivan? Richard stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to express my deep disappointment in what I believe to be a biased and incomplete evaluation process. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation, Richard expressing concern about my mental stability, suggesting the children had been coached, positioning himself as the victim of a system prejudiced against fathers. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes, his voice measured, reasonable, persuasive to anyone who didn't know the truth behind his words. When he finished, Judge Harmon turned to me. Mrs. Sullivan? I stood, my heart pounding, but my mind clear. I didn't look at my notes. Instead, I took Dr. Reeves's advice and spoke directly from the heart. Your Honor, I'm not here to convince you that I'm a perfect mother. I've made mistakes. I stayed in a harmful marriage too long. I sometimes struggle to set appropriate boundaries. I worry constantly about making the right decisions for my children. I took a deep breath, feeling Richard's gaze on me but focusing only on the judge. What I can tell you is that I know my children, truly know them. I know that Max needs time to process his emotions, that he thrives with gentle guidance rather than harsh criticism. I know that Lily carries too much responsibility on her young shoulders, that she needs to be reminded it's safe to be a child sometimes. I described our daily life, homework at the kitchen table, weekend trips to the library, the therapy sessions that were helping both children express their feelings healthily. I talked about the progress we'd made and the challenges we still faced. The recordings Lily made weren't my idea, I said, addressing the issue directly. They were the action of a child trying to protect herself and her brother the only way she knew how. The fact that she felt that responsibility should break all of our hearts. I glanced at Richard, then back to the judge. I don't want to deny my children a relationship with their father. I want that relationship to be healthy, respectful, and safe. Right now it isn't. The supervision, the parenting classes, the therapy. Dr. Reeves recommended, these aren't punishments. They're pathways to healing for our entire family. I finished by speaking directly to what I believed the children needed: stability, emotional safety, freedom to express themselves without fear, consistent and loving boundaries. Your Honor, my children are learning what love looks like from how they're treated now. I want them to know that love is kind, that it builds up rather than tears down, that it respects rather than controls. That's the future I'm fighting for. When I sat down, the courtroom was silent. Judge Harmon studied me for a moment, then turned to his notes, reviewing them carefully before speaking. I've considered the evidence presented throughout these proceedings, the initial filings, the recordings submitted by the minor child, the professional evaluations, and the testimony from both parents. He looked up, his expression grave. It is the finding of this court that the minor children, Lily and Max Sullivan, have been subjected to a pattern of emotional manipulation and psychological control in Mr. Sullivan's care that has resulted in documented anxiety, sleep disturbances, and behavioral regression. Richard shifted in his seat, his facade of calm beginning to crack. Based on this finding, primary physical and legal custody is awarded to Mrs. Sullivan, with Mr. Sullivan granted supervised visitation twice monthly, contingent upon his completion of the parenting program recommended by Dr. Reeves and ongoing participation in therapy. Judge Harmon continued, outlining the specific terms of the custody arrangement, but I barely heard the details. We had won. The children would stay with me. They would be safe. Richard's reaction was immediate and revealing. His face flushed. With anger, his control slipping as he turned to his attorney, whispering furiously. Gone was the concerned father act, replaced by the true Richard, enraged at not getting his way. As the judge finished and prepared to adjourn, Richard stood abruptly. Your Honor, I intend to appeal this decision immediately. These allegations are completely unfounded, and I've been denied due process. Judge Harmon regarded him steadily. Mr. Sullivan, you are entitled to appeal. However, I strongly urge you to consider whether continuing this legal battle serves your children's best interests or merely your own. Richard didn't respond, but his expression said everything. This wasn't about the children for him. It never had been. Outside the courtroom, Sandra hugged me tightly. Congratulations, she said. Your testimony was perfect, authentic, focused on the children. Exactly what Judge Harmon needed to hear. I felt oddly calm, relieved certainly, but also aware that this victory, significant as it was, marked the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of our story. Richard would likely appeal. The supervised visits would bring their own challenges. The children's healing process would continue, with progress and setbacks along the way. But for the first time in years, I felt truly hopeful. We had a foundation now, legal protection, validation of what we'd experienced. The truth had been heard and acknowledged. As I walked to my car, I spotted Richard and Eleanor by the courthouse entrance, engaged in intense conversation. Eleanor noticed me first, her expression hardening. She nudged Richard, who turned to look at me. For a moment, we simply regarded each other across the distance. Former partners, still connected through our children but no longer bound by his control. Then, without a word, I turned away and continued to my car. The victory wasn't in confronting Richard or proving him wrong. It was in walking away, in choosing a different path for myself and my children, in refusing to engage in the power struggle he craved. Driving home, I thought about how I would tell Lily and Max about the judge's decision, not as a triumph over their father, but as reassurance that their voices had been heard, that their feelings mattered, that they were safe. I thought about the road ahead, the practical challenges of single parenthood, the emotional work of helping the children process their experiences, the delicate balance of supporting their relationship with Richard while protecting them from his manipulation. It wouldn't be easy. But as I pulled into our apartment complex and saw Kate and the kids waiting on the balcony, their faces anxious and hopeful, I knew with absolute certainty that it would be worth it. This wasn't just about custody. It was about breaking a cycle of emotional abuse that could have continued into the next generation. It was about showing Lily and Max that they deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. It was about creating a home where truth was valued over appearance, where feelings were honored rather than exploited, where love didn't come with conditions. As I stepped out of the car, Lily called down, "Mom, what happened?" I looked up. At her and Max, these resilient, remarkable children who had shown more courage than any child should have to. "We won," I called back, my voice steady and clear. "We're staying together." Their reactions, Max's whoop of joy, Lily's quiet smile of relief, told me everything I needed to know. This was what victory really looked like. Not a legal decision or a defeated opponent, but children who could finally exhale, who could begin to trust that their world wouldn't be upended again, who could focus on being kids instead of survivors. As I climbed the stairs to join them, I felt something settle within me. A certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, stronger for what we'd already overcome, guided by the truth that had finally been heard. That night, we celebrated with takeout pizza and a movie marathon, simple pleasures that felt luxurious in their normalcy. The kids chose animated films, bright and hopeful stories where families overcame obstacles together. We built a fort, in the living room with blankets and couch cushions, something we hadn't done since before the separation. Max fell asleep halfway through the second movie, curled against my side with his favorite stuffed dinosaur clutched to his chest. For the first time in months, his face looked completely peaceful. Lily stayed awake longer, though I could see exhaustion in the shadows under her eyes. When Max was deeply asleep, she turned to me, her voice quiet in the blue glow of the TV screen. "Is Dad going to appeal, like he said he would?" I considered sugarcoating it, protecting her from the reality that our battle might not be over. But one of Richard's most damaging patterns had been dishonesty, making promises he didn't intend to keep, creating false expectations, using half-truths to manipulate. I'd promised myself I wouldn't continue that pattern, even when the truth was difficult. He might, I admitted, but the judge's decision was very clear, based on strong evidence. An appeal would be challenging for him to win. She nodded, processing this. "If he does appeal, will I have to record more conversations or testify?" "No," I said firmly. "You've done your part, Lily, more than any child should have to do. If there's an appeal, it will be handled by the lawyers and the judge. Your job now is just to be 14. She smiled slightly at that. "I'm not sure I remember how." The comment broke my heart. Lily had been carrying adult burdens for so long, mediating between Richard and me during our marriage, protecting Max from the worst of Richard's criticism, gathering evidence when the adults in her life failed to see what was happening. She'd lost pieces of her childhood that could never be reclaimed. "Well, I have some ideas," I said, keeping my tone light despite the ache in my chest. Staying up too late reading, worrying about what to wear to school, texting friends about incomprehensible inside jokes, rolling your eyes when I ask about your day. She laughed, a real laugh, not the careful, controlled one she'd developed to avoid drawing Richard's negative attention. "I can definitely handle the eye-rolling part." "I'm counting on it," I replied, pulling her into a side hug. "Seriously, though, I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you. What you did, the recordings, speaking up, that took tremendous courage." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so scared," she finally admitted. "When I stood up in court that day, I thought I might throw up." "That's what makes it brave," I told her. "Doing something even when you're terrified, because it's the right thing to do." "Like you divorcing Dad?" she asked, looking up at me with eyes that missed nothing. I nodded. "Like that. I was scared too, of being alone, of not having enough. Money, of him taking you and Max away." I brushed her hair back from her forehead, a gesture from her childhood that she usually deemed too babyish now. "Tonight, she allowed it. But sometimes the scariest choice is the one that leads to freedom." She considered this, then said, "I'm glad you did it. Even with all the hard stuff after, I like who you are now better." "Who am I now?" I asked, curious about how she saw the changes in me. "You laugh more. For real, not like you're just being polite. And you say what you actually think instead of checking to see if it's okay first." She hesitated. "You seem bigger somehow, like you're not trying to disappear anymore." Her perception stunned me. I hadn't realized how visible my transformation had been to her, how clearly she'd observed my journey from Richard's shadow into my own light. "I like who I am now better, too," I told her honestly. We fell asleep there in the blanket fort, Max snoring softly, Lily's head on my shoulder. For the first time in over a year, I slept without waking, without the knot of anxiety that had become my constant companion. The next morning brought reality back into focus. It was a school day. There were lunches to pack, permission slips to sign, the ordinary machinery of life that continued regardless of courtroom dramas. But even these mundane tasks felt different now, infused with a sense of permanence and possibility that had been missing before. "Can we get a dog?" Max asked over breakfast, catching me off guard with the non sequitur. "What?" "A dog," he repeated, as if it were the most natural question in the world. "Dad always said no because they're messy and expensive. But we have our own place now, forever, right? So, can we?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something new in his expression. Hope. Not just for a pet, but for a future where his wishes mattered, where permanent joy was possible. "Not right this second," I said carefully. "But let's start researching what kind would be best for our apartment. Maybe over the summer, once school's out and we have more time." His face lit up. "Really? We can actually get one?" "Really," I confirmed. "We'll need to save up first and learn about training and care. It's a big responsibility." "I'll help," he declared, suddenly animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. "I can walk it and feed it and everything." Across the table, Lily caught my eye and smiled. A small, knowing smile that acknowledged what was really happening. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about Max believing in good things again, about him understanding that his mother's yes was reliable, that promises in our home would be kept. As the kids grabbed their backpacks and headed for the door, I felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost dizzying. Not just for the custody ruling, but for this, for ordinary morning chaos, for Max's renewed enthusiasm, for Lily's perceptive smile, for the chance to parent without Richard's shadow looming over every decision. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Richard, true to form, filed an appeal, but Sandra assured me it was largely procedural and unlikely to succeed, given the strength of the evidence and the clarity of Judge Harmon's ruling. The supervised visits continued every other Saturday, still tense, still carefully managed by Mrs. Patel, but with clearer boundaries now that Richard understood the court was watching closely. With the immediate threat of losing custody behind us, I could focus on rebuilding, not just our daily lives, but the children's sense of security and my own identity beyond survival mode. I accepted a promotion at the bookstore, moving from part-time clerk to events coordinator, ironically, returning to the kind of work I'd done before marrying Richard. The salary increase wasn't dramatic, but it meant fewer financial worries and the satisfaction of using skills I'd once excelled at before Richard's criticism had made me doubt my capabilities. The children began to flourish in small but significant ways. Max's nightmares decreased from several times a week to occasional disturbances. His teacher noted improved concentration and participation in class. Lily joined the school newspaper, something she'd been interested in but had avoided because Richard considered it a waste of time that wouldn't help with college applications. She made new friends, started spending less time in her room, began expressing opinions without first checking if they were acceptable. Dr. Chen continued to work with both children, helping them process their experiences and develop healthy coping mechanisms. "They're making remarkable progress," she told me during one of our parent consultations. "Children are naturally resilient when given safety and consistency. You're providing both." Not everything was smooth, of course. Richard's influence remained, particularly with Lily, who still occasionally fell into the people-pleasing patterns she'd developed to manage his approval. Max had occasional regressions, periods of clingy behavior or unexplained anger, usually, after visits with Richard. There were financial stresses, logistical challenges of single parenthood, moments of exhaustion and doubt. But underlying it all was a foundation that hadn't existed before. The knowledge that we were safe, that our family unit was legally protected, that the truth had been heard and validated. 3 months after the final custody ruling, Richard's appeal was denied. Sandra called with the news on a Tuesday morning while I was setting up for a book signing event. The appellate court upheld Judge Harmon's decision completely, she explained. They found his ruling was well supported by the evidence and professional evaluations. So it's really over? I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Legally, yes. Richard could technically attempt another appeal to a higher court, but it would be extremely costly and even less likely to succeed. She paused. Amanda, you should feel very proud. Cases involving emotional abuse are notoriously difficult to prove. Your documentation, Lily's recordings, your consistent focus on the children's well-being rather than attacking Richard, all of it created an unusually strong case. After we hung up, I stood in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by shelves of stories, some tragic, some triumphant, all containing characters who faced challenges and emerged changed. I thought about our own story, still being written, but with a new chapter clearly beginning. That evening, I told the children about the appeal being denied. Max responded with immediate joy, dancing around the kitchen and announcing that this meant we could definitely get a dog now. Lily's reaction was more subdued, relief mixed with something like sadness. Later, after Max was in bed, she found me folding laundry in my room. "Can I ask you something?" she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Always." She twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "Do you think Dad will ever change? Like, really change? Not just pretend to for the court?" The question caught me off guard. Despite everything Richard had put us through, Lily still longed for a healthy relationship with her father, a natural desire that broke my heart with its simplicity and improbability. "I don't know," I answered honestly. Change is possible for anyone, but it requires acknowledging there's a problem first. Your dad doesn't believe he's done anything wrong. She nodded, having expected this answer. "The parenting classes and therapy the judge ordered, do you think they'll help?" "They could, if he takes them seriously." I folded the last towel and set it in the basket. "But Lily, I want you to understand something important. Whether your dad changes or not isn't your responsibility. It's not a reflection on you, and it doesn't determine your value or your future." "I know that," she said, but her expression suggested otherwise. I patted the bed beside me, and she came to sit down. "When I was about your age," I began, "my dad left, just walked out one day and barely looked back. For years, I thought if I'd been smarter, prettier, more accomplished, he might have stayed. I blamed myself for his choices." Lily looked surprised. I rarely spoke about my father, and she'd never met him. "What happened?" I eventually realized his leaving wasn't about me at all. It was about him, his issues, his limitations. And once I understood that, I could stop trying to earn the love of someone who wasn't capable of giving it the way I needed. I took her hand. "I'm not saying your dad can't love you, but his version of love comes with conditions that aren't healthy for you. That's not something you can fix by being better or different." She was quiet for a long time, processing. "This. That's really sad," she finally said. "It is," I agreed. "But it's also freeing. Because once you stop trying to change someone else, you can focus on your own growth, your own happiness." "Is that what you did, after the divorce?" I nodded. "It took time. I spent years trying to be what your dad wanted, changing myself to avoid his disapproval. Unlearning those patterns wasn't easy. I smiled at her, but it was worth it. Because the person I actually am is so much happier than the person I was pretending to be. She leaned against my shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become more frequent since the custody ruling. I'm glad you're you now. Me too, I said softly. And I'm incredibly glad you're you. Exactly as you are. The following Saturday was a scheduled visitation day. Richard arrived at the neutral meeting location, a family center with supervised visitation rooms, looking unusually subdued. The denial of his appeal seemed to have punctured his confidence, made him recognize that his usual tactics weren't working. Mrs. Patel greeted us with her characteristic warmth, explaining that she'd set up board games and art supplies in the visitation room. As the children went ahead with her, Richard caught my eye. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual authoritative edge. "Just for a minute." I hesitated, wary of any private conversation. "Mrs. Patel needs to be present for any discussion," I reminded him, the boundaries established by the court still fresh in my mind. "That's fine," he said, surprising me. I want to know what I need to do, to have a real relationship with them." The question seemed genuine, which made it all the more startling. In all our years together and the months of legal battles, Richard had never once asked what he needed to do differently. He'd only defended his actions, justified his behavior, blamed others for misinterpreting his intentions. "Are you asking seriously?" I clarified, still skeptical. He nodded, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he controlled it. The appeal being denied. It's made me think. I don't want to be a part-time father seeing my kids in supervised visits for the next 4 years. I studied him, looking for the manipulation behind the words. But what I saw instead was something unfamiliar on Richard's face. Uncertainty. The court's decision had shaken his worldview, forced him to confront the possibility that his behavior, not my vindictiveness, not biased evaluators, not an unfair system, was the reason for his current situation. "The parenting classes and therapy the court ordered aren't just hoops to jump through," I said carefully. "They're actually the answer to your question. You need to understand how your behavior affects Lily and Max, how to support their emotional needs instead of using them to meet your own." He frowned, clearly not entirely comfortable with this framing. "I've always provided for them, given them everything. Material things, yes. Stability, no. Emotional safety, definitely not." I kept my voice even, factual rather than accusatory. "They need a father who listens more than he speaks, who validates their feelings rather than telling them what they should feel, who sees them as individuals with their own needs and preferences, not extensions of himself." I expected defensiveness, maybe anger. Instead, Richard was quiet, contemplative. "I don't know how to be that person," he finally admitted, the word seeming to physically pain him. "That's what the therapy is for," I pointed out. "But Richard, it only works if you're honest, with the therapist and with yourself. If you go in trying to prove you're right and everyone else is wrong, nothing will change." Before he could respond, Mrs. Patel appeared in the hallway. "The children are settled in the visitation room," she said. "Mr. Sullivan, they're asking for you." Richard nodded, then looked back at me. "I'll think about what you said." I watched him walk away, unsure if I'd just witnessed the first crack in his facade or simply a new strategy now that his legal options had been exhausted. Either way, I felt a strange sense of peace. Richard's growth or stagnation was his responsibility. Now, not mine. My focus could remain where it belonged, on the children and our healing journey together. That journey continued over the coming months, with milestones both small and significant. Max's 10th birthday arrived, The first since the separation, where he didn't ask if his father would be attending his party. Instead, he requested a science-themed celebration at the Natural History Museum, inviting classmates who had slowly become friends again as his anxiety decreased. Watching him lead his guests through the dinosaur exhibit, pointing out facts he'd memorized, laughing freely, I saw a child reclaiming joy that had been suppressed under Richard's critical eye. The boy who had once been afraid to speak up for fear of saying the wrong thing was now confidently explaining the difference between herbivores and carnivores to a captivated audience. Lily's transformation was more subtle, but equally profound. She began expressing interests Richard had dismissed: photography, creative writing, environmental activism. She dyed a streak of purple in her hair, a small act of self-expression that would have been unthinkable under Richard's rigid expectations. She started keeping a journal, telling me it helped her sort through her thoughts and feelings. "I'm writing about everything that happened," she explained one evening. "Not to show anyone, just for me. Dr. Chen says writing our stories helps us make sense of them." As for me, I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant during my marriage: my love of organizing community events, my knack for connecting people with books that spoke to their experiences, my ability to make decisions confidently without seeking approval. I started a book club at the store focused on resilience and personal growth, creating a space where people could share their own journeys through difficult circumstances. Many of the participants were women emerging from controlling relationships, though we never explicitly framed it that way. The shared understanding in the room was palpable, the mutual support powerful in its simplicity. One evening, after a particularly moving discussion, a woman named Janet stayed behind to help me rearrange the chairs. She'd been coming to the group for about a month, quietly absorbing others' stories before sharing glimpses of her own difficult marriage. "I filed for divorce yesterday," she told me, her voice a mix of terror and triumph. "After 7 years of making excuses, convincing myself it wasn't that bad, I finally did it." "That's huge," I said, genuinely proud of her. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but also like I can breathe for the first time in years." She hesitated. "Your story, what you shared about standing up in court, about rebuilding afterward, it helped me believe I could do this." Her words struck me deeply. I'd started the book club hoping to create a supportive community, never imagining my own experience could directly impact someone else's path to freedom. "The first steps are the hardest," I told her, "but I promise it gets easier. Not always in a straight line, but the trend is upward." She smiled, relief evident in her expression. That's exactly what I needed to hear today. As we finished tidying the space, I reflected on how sharing our stories, whether in courtrooms or book clubs or late-night conversations, created ripples we might never fully trace. Lily's courage in recording Richard and speaking up had changed, not just our family's trajectory but potentially Janet's as well. And who knew how many others through this expanding circle of truth-telling and healing. 6 months after the final custody ruling, Richard surprised everyone by completing the court-ordered parenting program and consistently attending therapy. His supervised visits gradually became less tense, more focused on the children's interests, rather than his agenda. He stopped bringing Eleanor, whose presence had always heightened everyone's anxiety. He began asking questions about the kids' activities and actually listening to their answers instead of using the information to criticize my parenting. These changes weren't dramatic transformations. Richard was still Richard, with his need for control and difficulty acknowledging others' emotional realities. But they were significant enough that Mrs. Patel recommended moving to less restrictive supervision after his completion of the initial court requirements. When she made this suggestion during our quarterly review meeting, I felt a conflicting mix of hope and apprehension. Part of me wanted to believe Richard was genuinely changing. A larger part feared it was an act that would dissolve once the supervision was reduced. "What do you think?" I asked the children that evening. "Would you feel comfortable with Dad having longer visits, Maybe sometimes outside the family center? Max shrugged, non-committal. He's been nicer lately, not so angry when I talk about stuff at our house. Lily was more thoughtful. I think he's trying, she said. Not perfect, but better than before. And honestly, the supervised visits are kind of awkward now that we're not fighting all the time. Their perspectives helped. Me see past my own lingering distrust. This wasn't about Richard deserving another chance or about my willingness to forgive. It was about the children's relationship with their father and what they needed to heal and grow. We'll take it slow, I decided. Maybe start with supervised visits at a park or restaurant before considering unsupervised time. The gradual transition proved to be the right approach. Richard maintained his improved behavior as the settings became less restrictive. There were occasional slips, comments about, "When you're older, you'll understand why I fought so hard," or subtle digs about my financial limitations, but they were fewer and farther between, and the children had developed the confidence to either challenge these statements or discuss them with me afterward. 1 year after the courthouse revelation that had changed everything, our family landscape had shifted dramatically. We still lived in the same apartment, but it felt different now, filled with photographs and art projects, evidence of a life, being fully lived rather than cautiously navigated. The children moved through the space with ease, no longer tiptoeing around emotional landmines. I made decisions without the weight of anticipated criticism, planned futures without the shadow of potential sabotage. Richard remained part of the children's lives, but in a more appropriate role, a father who visited rather than controlled, who was learning, imperfectly but genuinely, to see his children as individuals rather than extensions of himself or weapons against me. On the anniversary of the court hearing, I took the day off work, surprising the kids with a trip to a nearby lake. We packed a picnic, brought swimsuits despite the slightly cool weather, spent the day skipping rocks and building sandcastles and simply being together without agenda or expectation. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the water, Lily sat beside me on our picnic blanket, watching Max attempt to catch tiny fish in a plastic bucket. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. "When I showed the recording in court?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "It was a turning point for us." She nodded, thoughtful. "I was so scared. I thought I might throw up or faint or something. But then I just did it anyway." "That's what courage is," I told her. "Not the absence of fear, but action despite it." "I learned that from you," she said, surprising me. "Watching you stand up to Dad, even when you were afraid. Seeing you rebuild everything after he tried to take it all away." Her words touched me deeply. Throughout the custody battle, I'd worried about the impact on the children, the stress, the divided loyalties, the exposure to adult conflicts. I hadn't considered that they might also be witnessing a model of courage and resilience that would shape their understanding of what was possible in the face of intimidation and control. "We've all been brave," I said, including her in the acknowledgement. "And look where it got us." We gazed out at the lake, at Max laughing as fish eluded his efforts, at the peaceful beauty of an ordinary day that would have been impossible in our previous life. The path ahead wasn't perfectly clear or without challenges. Richard would always be a complicated presence in our lives. Financial pressures would continue. The children would face the normal struggles of growing up, alongside the specific challenges of healing from emotional trauma. But sitting there on that blanket, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, I felt a certainty that had been absent for so long. We would be okay, more than okay. We would thrive, not despite what we'd endured, but partly because of it, because we had discovered our own strength, learned to trust our perceptions, found our voices when it mattered most. The truth that Lily had bravely revealed in that courtroom had set us all free, not just from Richard's control, but from the smaller lives we might have lived if we'd never learned how powerful we truly were. as the golden light faded to soft twilight. Max abandoned his fishing efforts and flopped down beside us, wet and sandy and completely content. Lily reached out to ruffle his hair, an affectionate gesture between siblings who had protected each other through the darkest days. I wrapped an arm around each of them, these remarkable children who had taught me as much about courage as I had taught them. "Ready to head home?" I asked as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. "Not yet," Lily said, leaning her head against my shoulder. "Let's stay a little longer." So we did, the three of us together, watching nightfall, on one chapter of our lives while gathering strength for whatever the next might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.